In the humid darkness of 1857 Louisiana, 7 young girls vanished from St. Marguerite's Parish School within a single week. Their bodies were never found, their screams were never heard, and when the bishop arrived to investigate, he left town the same night, taking his secrets to the grave. St. Marguerite's Parish stood like a weathered sentinel against the Louisiana bayou, its whitewashed walls bleeding rust stains in the oppressive summer heat of 1857. Spanish moss draped the ancient oaks surrounding the small schoolhouse, creating shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose even when no breeze stirred the thick, sulphurous air. The parish served the forgotten, French Creole families whose fortunes had withered since the American purchase, freed slaves seeking salvation in the promises of the Catholic Church, and Irish immigrants who had fled famine only to find themselves trapped in Louisiana's suffocating embrace. These were people the world had abandoned, clinging to faith as their only lifeline in a land that devoured hope. Sister Marie-Claire Thibodeau ran the parish school with an iron hand wrapped in velvet. Born to Louisiana aristocracy before yellow fever claimed her family's plantation, she had taken holy vows not from calling but from necessity. Her severe black habit made her appear as a moving shadow against the school's whitewashed walls, and her pale blue eyes missed nothing, not the bruises on young faces, not the hunger in thin bodies, not the fear that lived permanently in the hearts of her charges. The school itself was modest, 3 rooms connected by narrow hallways that creaked with every footstep. The main classroom held 22 wooden desks, worn smooth by generations of restless hands. Religious iconography covered every wall, the Sacred Heart bleeding eternal love, St. Joan burning for her visions, and the Virgin Mary weeping, tears that seemed to glisten in the candlelight long after the flames had been extinguished. But it was the basement that held the school's darkest secret. Officially, it stored supplies, prayer books, candles, communion wine. Unofficially, it served another purpose entirely, one that Sister Marie-Claire never spoke of in her nightly prayers. The heavy wooden door bore 3 locks, and only she possessed the keys. Local children whispered that strange sounds echoed from below during the longest nights, but whispers in St. Marguerite's Parish had a way of dying on the lips of those brave enough to speak them. The 7 girls who would soon vanish attended classes in this suffocating atmosphere of hidden sins and unspoken truths. They ranged in age from 8 to 14, daughters of the desperate and dispossessed. Each carried scars, some visible on their skin, others buried deep in their souls. They had learned early that survival meant silence, that questions brought punishment, and that adults could not be trusted to protect them from the very institutions meant to provide sanctuary. None of them could have imagined that their silence would soon become eternal. Would you have sent your child to a school where the adults kept locked doors and whispered secrets? Marie-Celeste Boudreau possessed eyes the color of storm clouds and hair so black it seemed to absorb light. At 14, she was the eldest, the unofficial protector of the younger girls. Her father had died in a logging accident when she was 12, leaving her mother to work in the parish laundry, while Marie-Celeste helped raise her 3 younger siblings. She carried herself with a dignity that made grown men step aside on the street. But Sister Marie-Claire had noticed something different about her lately, a haunted quality, as if she had seen something that aged her beyond her years. Evangeline Tran was only 8, the daughter of Vietnamese immigrants who had somehow found their way to this forgotten corner of Louisiana. Her delicate features and almond-shaped eyes made her stand out among the predominantly Creole and Irish students, making her a target for cruel whispers. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her voice carried the musical quality of someone who thought in one language while speaking another. Sister Marie-Claire often found her drawing strange symbols in the margins of her prayer book, symbols that seemed to writhe and move in the flickering candlelight. The Fontenot twins, Celeste and Celestine, were 10 years old and identical except for a small scar above Celeste's left eyebrow, a reminder of the night their stepfather's anger had found a target. They moved as one organism, finishing each other's sentences, sharing dreams, and somehow always knowing when the other was in pain. The other children found them unsettling, the way they would simultaneously turn their heads toward sounds no one else could hear. Gabrielle Arsenault, at 13, came from a family that traced their lineage back to the original French settlers. But lineage meant nothing when your father drank away the family fortune and your mother disappeared into laudanum-induced stupors. Gabrielle had learned to fend for herself, developing a sharp tongue and sharper instincts. She questioned everything, challenged everyone, and refused to accept the easy answers that satisfied most children her age. 12-year-old Josephine Bro carried the burden of being her mother's confession keeper. When Mama came home with torn dresses and bruises, she blamed on clumsiness. It was Josephine who helped clean the wounds and promised never to tell. The weight of these secrets had carved premature lines around her young eyes and taught her that some truths were too dangerous to speak. Finally, there was 9-year-old Antoinette Guillory, small even for her age, with a voice like a bird's whistle and an uncanny ability to slip through shadows unnoticed. She had been born during a hurricane. He and the midwife had whispered that storm children could see things others couldn't. Antoinette never confirmed or denied this, but she had a habit of staring at empty corners and whispering to invisible companions. These 7 girls shared more than just their Catholic education. They shared secrets that would die with them. What secrets do you think these young girls discovered that made them so dangerous? The first signs of wrongness began on August 7, 1857, when the morning prayers turned sour in the throats of the faithful. Sister Marie Claire noticed it first, how the Latin words seemed to catch and stumble, as if the very air resisted their holy intentions. The communion wine, freshly blessed, developed an odd metallic taste that left parishioners with headaches that lasted for days. Marie-Celeste Boudreau had been acting strangely for weeks, but now her behavior took on an urgent quality. She lingered after classes, finding excuses to help Sister Marie Claire with tasks that required access to areas typically forbidden to students. Her younger charges noticed how she would pause mid-sentence during conversations, tilting her head as if listening to distant voices only she could hear. The bayou itself seemed infected with unease. Local fishermen reported that their catches came up diseased, covered in strange growths that pulsed with their own heartbeat. The water had taken on a reddish tinge that the old-timers claimed meant the ancestors were angry. Mosquitoes swarmed in biblical proportions, their droning creating an almost musical quality that seemed to hypnotize those who listened too closely. Inside the parish school, the younger children began experiencing shared nightmares. Parents reported that their daughters would wake screaming about the man in the cellar and the books that bled words. When questioned individually, each girl described identical details: a tall figure in clerical robes whose face remained always in shadow, ancient texts that opened to reveal pages written in what looked suspiciously like dried blood, and a ceremony that required the participation of 7 pure souls. Sister Marie Claire dismissed these nightmares as hysteria, but privately she had been experiencing her own disturbing visions. During her midnight prayers, she would find herself drawn to the basement door, her hands trembling as they touched the cold metal of the 3 locks. Sometimes she could swear she heard chanting in languages that predated Christ, rising from beneath the floorboards like smoke from hell's fires. The local doctor, Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, no relation to Sister Marie Claire despite sharing her surname, noted an unusual number of women seeking treatment for what they described as night terrors and walking dreams. His medical training could explain the symptoms, but not their sudden prevalence among the mothers of young girls attending the parish school. By August 10th, the 7 girls had begun meeting in secret, sharing whispered conversations that ceased immediately when adults approached. Evangeline Tran, who normally never spoke unless directly addressed, had started humming haunting melodies that seemed to echo through the school's corridors long after she had passed. The Fontenot twins had begun moving with an even more uncanny synchronization, their identical movements creating the illusion of one person reflected in a mirror. Something was building in St. Marguerite's Parish, something that fed on innocence and secrecy. Do you believe children can sense evil before adults notice the danger? Father Lucien Dufresne arrived on August the 12th aboard a riverboat that belched black smoke against the oppressive Louisiana sky. Unlike the humble priests who typically served the forgotten parishes of the bayou, Dufresne carried himself with the arrogance of New Orleans aristocracy. His vestments were silk rather than rough cotton, his hands soft and pale as candle wax, unmarked by honest labor or genuine service to the poor. Sister Marie Claire received him in the parish office, noting immediately how his dark eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of the modest room, the location of keys, the contents of desk drawers left slightly ajar, the religious artifacts that could be easily moved or removed. When he smiled, which he did often, his teeth appeared too sharp, as if filed to points. "I've come at the request of Bishop Roussel," Father Dufresne explained, his voice carrying the cultured tones of French quarter society. "There have been reports concerning the spiritual health of this parish, concerns about the children's education, their moral development." He paused, letting his gaze linger on a window that provided a clear view of the schoolyard where the 7 girls played during recess. The children themselves reacted to Father Dufresne's presence with instinctive wariness. Marie-Celeste Boudreau, normally respectful to all clergy, found excuses to avoid being alone with him. Evangeline Tran stopped humming her strange melodies whenever he appeared, while the Fontenot twins would grip each other's hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. Little Antoinette Guillory, who supposedly could see things others couldn't, began having what appeared to be seizures whenever Father Dufresne conducted services. During his first week at St. Marguerite's, Father Dufresne made several unusual requests. He asked for detailed records of all the female students, including their family backgrounds, religious education, and any special qualities they might possess. He requested access to the basement for prayer and meditation, claiming he needed solitude to properly commune with God. Most disturbing of all, he began conducting individual spiritual counseling sessions with the 7 girls, sessions that took place behind locked doors and about which he insisted on absolute confidentiality. Local parents noticed changes in their daughters after these sessions. The girls became withdrawn, jumpy, and spoke in their sleep, using words that sounded like Latin but carried meanings that made no sense. Several mothers reported finding strange symbols drawn in charcoal on their daughters' bedroom walls, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Father Dufresne also showed unusual interest in the parish records dating back to the French colonial period. He spent hours in the archives, studying documents written in languages that predated the Catholic Church's arrival in Louisiana. When Sister Marie Claire asked about his research, he claimed he was seeking to understand the spiritual foundation upon which this parish was built. But foundations, as the 7 girls were about to discover, could hide more than just cornerstones and buried pipes. What would you do if a strange priest started asking too many questions about your child? Marie-Celeste Boudreau discovered the truth on the night of August 18th, when curiosity and growing dread finally overcame her natural caution. She had volunteered to stay late, helping Sister Marie Claire organize prayer books, but her real purpose was far more dangerous. As the nun retired to her private quarters, Marie-Celeste retrieved a set of keys she had carefully copied using candle wax impressions, a skill learned from her late father, who had been a locksmith before the logging accident claimed his life. The basement door opened with a whisper rather than the creak she had expected. The air that rushed up from below carried scents that had no place in a holy building, sulfur, burning herbs, and something else, something organic and wrong that made her stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. She descended the wooden stairs, each step careful and deliberate, her stolen candle casting dancing shadows on walls that seemed to absorb more light than they reflected. What she found defied every teaching the Catholic Church had provided about good and evil. The basement had been converted into something that resembled a chapel, but one designed for worship that predated Christ by millennia. Symbols carved directly into the stone walls seemed to writhe in the candlelight, not Christian crosses but spirals and curves that hurt to look at directly. An altar made of what appeared to be human bones supported an open book written in a language that made her eyes water to read. But it was the 7 smaller altars arranged in a perfect circle around the main one that made her blood freeze. Each bore a name carefully carved into its surface: Marie-Celeste, Evangeline, Celeste, Celestine, Gabrielle, Josephine, and Antoinette. Fresh flowers had been placed on each altar, along with personal items clearly stolen from the girls. A hair ribbon here, a fragment of torn dress there, a small crucifix that belonged to Evangeline. The book on the central altar lay open to a page that described a ritual requiring 7 vessels of innocence to complete what it called the summoning of the first darkness. The text, while difficult to decipher, made clear that the ritual would grant its performer power over both the living and the dead, but only if completed during the dark moon that would occur in 3 days. Marie Celeste's hands shook as she turned the pages, finding detailed preparations that had clearly been in motion for weeks. Father Dufresne's handwriting filled the margins, noting which girls showed the proper spiritual receptivity and which would require additional preparation before the ceremony. She was so absorbed in her horrifying discovery that she didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs behind her until Father Dufresne's voice echoed through the unholy chamber. "Ah, Marie Celeste, you're early, but no matter. We can begin your preparation tonight." The candle flame flickered once, then died, plunging them both into absolute darkness. Would you have run or tried to save the others first? Marie Celeste never returned home that night. When her mother, Isabelle Boudreau, arrived at the parish school the following morning to inquire about her daughter's absence, Sister Marie-Claire could only offer hollow reassurances wrapped in nervous smiles. "She must have left early," the nun insisted, though her hands trembled as she spoke. "Perhaps she's already at home, helping with the younger children." But Isabelle knew her daughter's routines as intimately as her own heartbeat. Marie Celeste never varied from her path, school to home, home to school, with brief stops at the market only when specifically instructed. The girl's sense of responsibility was legendary in their small community. She would never simply disappear without word, especially knowing her siblings depended on her for their evening meal. By afternoon, whispers had begun spreading through the parish like spilled wine through cotton. The other 6 girls exhibited strange behaviors that set their parents' nerves on edge. Evangeline Tran spoke in urgent Vietnamese to her grandmother, describing visions of dark water rising and the hungry priest who eats prayers. The old woman's face turned ashen as she listened, her gnarled hands making protective gestures that predated any Christian influence. The Fontenot twins had barricaded themselves in their bedroom, pushing furniture against the door and refusing to come out even for meals. When their mother finally forced entry, she found them huddled together, drawing the same symbol over and over on scraps of paper, a spiral that seemed to pull the eye inward until looking at it caused physical nausea. "He took Marie Celeste to the hungry place," Celeste whispered. "We're next," Celestine finished. Gabrielle Arsenault, always the most outspoken, tried to warn the adults, but her reputation for challenging authority worked against her. When she burst into the general store claiming that Father Dufresne was not really a priest and that something terrible had happened to Marie Celeste, the adults dismissed her words as attention-seeking dramatics from a girl known for her wild imagination. Little Antoinette Guillory had stopped speaking entirely, but her behavior became increasingly erratic. She would stand in the schoolyard, staring at spots where nothing visible existed, carrying on animated conversations with empty air. When other children tried to engage her, she would only point toward the parish building and shake her head violently, tears streaming down her small face. Josephine Brault, burdened with keeping her family's secrets, added one more to her collection. She had seen Marie Celeste entering the parish building late the previous evening, but had said nothing, assuming it was another of the older girl's mysterious errands. Now guilt gnawed at her like a living thing, whispering that she could have prevented whatever terrible fate had befallen her friend. As the sun set on August 19th, 6 families went to bed knowing their daughters were marked for something unspeakable. The 7th family still waited for a daughter who would never come home. Do you think the adults truly didn't believe the children, or were they too frightened to act? The records Father Dufresne studied so intently in the parish archives told a story that the Catholic Church had worked for generations to suppress. St. Marguerite's parish had been built upon ground that was sacred long before European feet touched Louisiana soil. The Chitimacha tribe had considered this particular bayou bend a place where the spirit world pressed close against the physical realm, a thin membrane between what was and what could be. French colonists had chosen the location not despite its mystical reputation, but because of it. The earliest Catholic missionaries, men whose names had been carefully erased from official records, had not come to convert. the indigenous population to Christianity. They had come to learn, to study, to steal knowledge that European occultists had been seeking for centuries. These rogue priests had discovered that certain rituals, when performed at specific locations during particular celestial alignments, could grant abilities that had nothing to do with divine grace. Father Dufresne himself was the descendant of one such missionary, Jacques Dufresne, whose private journals described experiments in what he called spiritual transmutation. The process required 7 female subjects between the ages of 8 and 14, chosen not for their piety but for their spiritual receptivity, children who could see beyond the physical world, who carried the weight of secrets, who had been marked by suffering but not yet broken by it. The ritual itself was ancient, predating Christianity by millennia. It promised the practitioner dominion over both the living and the dead, the ability to command spirits, to extend life indefinitely, and to bend reality itself to one's will. But the price was absolute. 7 innocent souls had to be consumed completely, their life force channeled into the practitioner during the 3 nights of the dark moon. Marie-Celeste Boudreau had not been killed when Father Dufresne found her in the basement, not yet. The ritual required that each subject remain alive until the final moment, their terror and desperation feeding the dark energies that would fuel the transformation. She was now imprisoned somewhere within the parish building, alive but hidden, her screams muffled by stones that had absorbed the cries of countless victims over the centuries. Father Dufresne's careful study of each girl had revealed why they were perfect for his purposes. Marie-Celeste's natural leadership made her an ideal vessel for commanding energies. Evangeline's mystical heritage provided connection to spiritual realms. The Fontenot twins' psychic bond would amplify the ritual's power. Gabrielle's questioning nature could be twisted into the doubt necessary to weaken heaven's protection. Josephine's burden of secrets made her soul heavy with darkness, and little Antoinette's second sight would allow her to witness the spiritual transformation as it occurred. Each girl had been chosen, studied, and prepared without ever realizing they were marked for consumption. The dark moon would rise in 2 nights, and Father Dufresne's centuries-long family legacy would finally reach its horrific culmination. How do you think such evil traditions survive for generations without being stopped? Sister Marie-Claire Thibodeau had known the truth for 3 days, though she had suspected it for weeks. The woman who had taken holy vows after losing everything to yellow fever found herself facing a choice that would damn her soul regardless of which path she chose. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 20th, she knelt before the altar in the main chapel, rosary beads cutting into her palms as she gripped them with desperate intensity. Father Dufresne had not hidden his intentions from her, not entirely. He had spoken in riddles and half-truths, but the meaning was clear enough for someone who had spent years studying the historical documents hidden in the parish archives. She knew about the previous ceremonies, the children who had disappeared during dark moons throughout the decades. She knew about the priests who had served this parish before her time, men whose names had been struck from official records, but whose influence lingered in the symbols carved beneath layers of whitewash. The choice before her was brutally simple: help Father Dufresne complete his ritual, or watch him destroy not just the 7 girls, but potentially dozens more as he sought vessels capable of channeling the spiritual energy he required. He had made it clear that resistance would result in consequences that extended far beyond her own death. Her younger sister lived in New Orleans with her 3 children. Her elderly mother resided in a convent in Baton Rouge. Father Dufresne possessed resources and connections that could reach anyone she loved, anywhere they might try to hide, but cooperation came with its own terrible price. The ritual required her participation as the consecrated witness, the religious figure whose presence would provide the spiritual authority necessary to complete the transformation. Her hands would need to hold the ceremonial blade, her voice would speak the words that bound the girls' souls to their fate, and her sacred vows would be the very instrument that perverted heaven's protection into hell's invitation. She had tried writing letters to Bishop Roussel, but each attempt ended with her hands shaking so violently she could not hold the pen. She had considered fleeing, but Father Dufresne had made it clear that he possessed detailed knowledge of her family's locations and routines. She had even contemplated suicide, but her faith taught that such an act would damn her to the very hell she was trying to avoid helping to create. As the morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the floor where she knelt, Sister Marie Claire made her choice. It was not the choice of a saint or a hero. It was the choice of a broken woman who valued the lives of her family members more than the lives of 7 girls she had taught to trust her. She would help Father Dufresne, and she would spend eternity paying for that decision. But first, she would try to save at least one of them. What would you sacrifice to protect the people you love most? By the morning of August 20th, 6 families teetered on the edge of panic. What had begun as unusual behavior from their daughters had escalated into something that defied rational explanation. The girls refused to attend school, barricaded themselves in their rooms, and spoke in fevered whispers about shadows that moved wrong and prayers that turned backward in their mouths. Isabelle Boudreau had not slept since her daughter's disappearance. She haunted the parish grounds like a living ghost, searching for any trace of Marie Celeste, while Sister Marie Claire offered increasingly hollow reassurances. When she demanded to search the parish building room by room, Father Dufresne appeared with legal documents signed by civil authorities, forbidding any interference with church property. The papers were authentic, bearing seals that cost more money than anyone in their forgotten corner of Louisiana could afford to falsify. The Tran family faced additional obstacles. Evangeline's father spoke limited English, and his attempts to report his daughter's disturbing visions were dismissed by local authorities as the superstitious ramblings of foreign immigrants. His wife understood even less English but had begun performing protective rituals from their homeland, burning herbs that filled their small house with pungent smoke and chanting in Vietnamese that seemed to echo strangely in the humid air. The Fontenot twins' parents found themselves dealing with 2 children who moved and spoke as one organism. When Claude Fontenot tried to separate his daughters, they would scream in perfect unison until he allowed them to reunite. They had begun drawing symbols compulsively, covering every surface in their room with spirals that seemed to writhe when viewed from peripheral vision. Marie Fontenot, their stepmother, whispered to neighbors that she feared the girls were possessed by something that spoke through their mouths during the long, sleepless nights. Gabrielle Arsenault's warnings about Father Dufresne fell on deaf ears, partly because of her reputation for defiance, but mostly because the adults were too frightened to confront what her words might mean. Her father, Henri, had his own history with men who wielded religious authority as a weapon. He had seen what happened to those who challenged the church's representatives, even when those challenges were justified. His silence was the silence of a man who had learned that survival sometimes required looking away from evil. Dr. Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau documented the growing hysteria in his private journals, noting symptoms that had no medical explanation. Parents reported that their daughters seemed to age visibly with each passing day, their faces bearing expressions of knowledge too terrible for children to possess. Several mothers had begun experiencing shared nightmares, dreaming their daughters' dreams and waking with the taste of sulfur in their mouths. As the second night approached, the parents gathered in secret, whispering plans they were too terrified to implement, knowing they faced an enemy whose power extended far beyond their ability to resist. Meanwhile, their daughters counted down the hours until the dark moon rose, each knowing that only one night remained. Do you think the parents' fear was justified, or should they have acted despite the danger? On the morning of August 21st, only 5 girls remained free. They gathered in the abandoned sugar mill on the outskirts of St. Marguerite's Parish, a structure that had been claimed by kudzu and time but still provided shelter from eyes that watched from every window in town. The building's collapsed roof let in streams of sunlight that illuminated dust motes dancing like lost souls in the stifling air. Evangeline Tran spoke first, her usually soft voice carrying new strength born of desperation. In halting English mixed with Vietnamese phrases her grandmother had taught her, she described the visions that had plagued her dreams for weeks. The hungry priest, she called Father Dufresne, feeds on light that lives inside children. Marie Celeste. She paused, her small hands making gestures that needed no translation. The older girl was alive, but changed, dimmed, her spiritual light being slowly consumed to fuel something ancient and wrong. The Fontenot twins finished each other's sentences as always, but now their shared thoughts carried a weight that bent their young shoulders. "We see her," Celeste whispered. "In the place beneath the school," Celestine continued. "She's in a cage made of bones and prayers," they said together, their identical voices creating an eerie harmony that made the other girls shiver despite the Louisiana heat. Gabrielle Arsenault had stolen her father's hunting knife, its blade gleaming in the broken sunlight. At 13, she was now the eldest, the protector by default, and she wore that responsibility like armor. "The adults won't help us," she stated with bitter certainty. "They're too scared, or they don't believe, or maybe they're part of it." She had noticed how Father Dufresne spoke to certain men in town, how money seemed to change hands, how documents appeared when needed to prevent interference. 12-year-old Josephine Bro carried the heaviest burden of all. She had seen her mother talking to Father Dufresne the previous evening, had watched money pass between them, had heard her own name mentioned in hushed tones. The woman who should have protected her had instead accepted payment for her daughter's participation in something too terrible to name. "My mama sold me," she whispered, the words cutting through the humid air like a blade. Little Antoinette Guillory, who rarely spoke but supposedly saw everything, pointed toward the parish building visible through the mill's broken windows. Her finger traced patterns in the air that matched the symbols the twins had been drawing compulsively. "2 sons," she said clearly, her bird-like voice carrying strange authority. "Ritty. 2 sons. Then the darkness eats the light." The 5 girls looked at each other with the weighted gaze of soldiers before battle. Children, forced to become warriors in a war they had never asked to join. They had less than 48 hours to save themselves and their friend, armed with nothing but desperate courage and the terrible knowledge that no adult could be trusted to help them survive. If you were one of these girls, would you run or fight? Beneath St. Marguerite's Parish lay a network of tunnels that predated the Catholic Church by centuries. The Chitimaca had carved these passages into the limestone bedrock, creating a sacred space where their spiritual leaders could commune with the ancestors during times of great need. French colonists had expanded the tunnels, and subsequent priests had modified them further, each generation adding chambers for purposes that strayed further from holy intent. Marie-Celeste Boudreau discovered this hidden geography through necessity rather than choice. Father Dufresne had not simply imprisoned her in a basement room. He had placed her in the heart of this underground complex, in a chamber where the spiritual energy of centuries of rituals had soaked into the very stones. The walls around her bore carvings from dozens of cultures and time periods, Chitimaca spirit symbols, French occult markings, African protective wards left by enslaved people who had briefly served the parish, and Latin inscriptions that perverted Christian prayers into invocations of darker powers. The chamber itself was a perfect circle, its floor inscribed with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. 7 smaller alcoves ringed the space, each designed to hold a human figure during the final ceremony. Chains forged from a metal that felt wrong to the touch hung from rings set into the walls, their surfaces bearing stains that could have been rust, but possessed a distinctly organic quality. Marie-Celeste was not alone in this underground prison. The spirits of previous victims lingered in the shadows between the carved symbols, girls who had been consumed by similar rituals over the decades. They could not speak, but their presence whispered warnings through the sound of dripping water and shifting stones. Through their ghostly testimony, she began to understand the true scope of what Father Dufresne intended. The ritual required more than just 7 living victims. It demanded 7 willing participants. Girls who would accept their fate through despair rather than meeting death through resistance. The slow consumption of spiritual energy served a dual purpose. It weakened the girls' ability to fight while simultaneously preparing their souls for easier extraction. Fear, isolation, and hopelessness were as essential to the ceremony as the ancient words and ceremonial implements. But the spirits also revealed something Father Dufresne had not anticipated: the underground network connected to natural caverns that extended for miles through the Louisiana bedrock. These passages had served as escape routes for runaway slaves, hiding places during Indian raids, and smugglers' highways during various conflicts. Most importantly, they provided access to the parish building from unexpected directions, routes that bypassed the locked doors and watchful eyes above. Marie-Celeste began to understand that rescue might be possible, but only if the remaining girls could find courage beyond their years and knowledge beyond their education. The underground network that was meant to be her tomb might instead become the pathway to salvation. But first, her friends had to discover that she was still alive to save. How do you think places absorb the spiritual energy of what happens within them? Sister Marie-Claire Thibodeau made her choice in the grey hour before dawn on August 21st. Unable to directly defy Father Dufresne without condemning her family to death, she chose a different form of resistance, one that required her to betray her vows in order to honor them. She would break her promise of obedience to preserve the greater promise of protecting the innocent. The nun's plan was delicate as spider's silk and twice as likely to snap under pressure. She could not openly warn the girl's parents without triggering Father Dufresne's threatened revenge against her family, but she could create an opportunity for discovery. The question was whether the remaining 5 girls possessed the courage and intelligence necessary to seize that opportunity. During morning prayers, Sister Marie-Claire's voice carried strange inflections as she recited familiar Latin phrases. To adult ears, her words sounded like the traditional supplications they had heard throughout their lives. But to young minds more attuned to hidden meanings and secret communications, certain syllables seemed to linger, certain pauses created emphasis where none should exist. Requiem aeternam dona eis, Domine, she intoned, eternal rest grant unto them, Lord. But her eyes found Josephine Brault in the small congregation, and the girl understood that this prayer was being offered for someone still living. Et lux perpetua luceat eis, and let perpetual light shine upon them. But the way Sister Marie-Claire's gaze shifted toward the parish building's eastern wall suggested that this light was currently hidden in darkness, waiting to be found. After the service, Sister Marie-Claire began leaving subtle clues for those intelligent enough to interpret them. A ring of keys appeared on her desk, visible through the office window, with one key noticeably different from the others, older, made of a metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A map of the parish grounds was left open on the altar, with certain areas marked in what appeared to be accidental ink stains, but which formed a pattern pointing toward the building's foundation. Most tellingly, she began teaching the children new hymns, songs that seemed traditional but contained verses that spoke of light trapped beneath stone and 7 candles burning in darkness, and the faithful who wait for rescue in the deepest places. The melodies were haunting, designed to stick in young minds and replay during quiet moments when their true meanings might become clear. Her greatest risk was a direct encounter with Gabrielle Arsenault, the girl most likely to understand and act upon hidden warnings. When Gabrielle lingered after the morning service, Sister Marie-Claire handed her a prayer book that had been accidentally left open to Psalm 139. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning, and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. But written in pencil in the margin were words that had nothing to do with Scripture. The old key opens the foundation door. She waits below for rescue before tomorrow's midnight. Would you have understood Sister Marie-Claire's hidden message in time to act? Gabrielle Arsenault understood Sister Marie-Claire's message with the sharp clarity that comes to those who have learned not to trust the surface meaning of adult words. That afternoon, while the other 4 girls waited in the abandoned sugar mill, she made her way to the parish building under the pretense of retrieving a forgotten prayer book. The building stood empty in the afternoon heat, its windows reflecting the brutal Louisiana sun like watching eyes. The old key proved to be exactly what Sister Marie Claire's clues had suggested, a piece of metal so ancient it seemed to predate the Christian occupation of this land. It hung on the nun's keyring like a guilty secret, its surface carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The foundation door required more searching, but Gabrielle's systematic exploration of the building's exterior revealed a wooden panel nearly invisible. Beneath decades of accumulated moss and weather staining, the key turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been used recently despite its antique appearance. The door opened onto steps carved from solid stone, descending into darkness that seemed to swallow the afternoon sunlight without returning even the faintest reflection. Gabrielle had brought candles, but the flame guttered and nearly died as she entered the underground passage, as if the air itself resisted illumination. The tunnels were older and more extensive than anything she could have imagined. Passages branched in multiple directions, creating a labyrinth that extended far beyond the parish building's footprint. The walls bore the accumulated marks of centuries: primitive cave paintings, Catholic symbols, occult sigils and scratches that might have been made by human fingernails or might have been something else entirely. She followed the sound of water dripping, reasoning that moisture would indicate the deepest and oldest parts of the underground network. The passage led her through chambers that had clearly been used for purposes no Christian church would sanction. Altars stained with substances that looked organic in origin, circles of symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight, and implements whose purposes she could guess but preferred not to consider. Finally, she found the central chamber, and within it, Marie-Celeste Boudreau. The older girl was alive but changed, her skin pale as candle wax, her eyes holding knowledge that no 14-year-old should possess. She was chained to the wall with metal that felt wrong to the touch, cold despite the underground chamber's warmth, and inscribed with symbols that matched those carved into the stone floor. "Gabrielle," Marie-Celeste whispered, her voice carrying the weight of terrible discoveries. "You shouldn't have come alone. This place, it's hungry. It feeds on the light inside people, and once you've been here, it can always find you again." But even as she spoke these warnings, Marie-Celeste's eyes held desperate hope. Rescue was possible if her friends possessed courage beyond their years and were willing to risk everything for someone who might already be lost. How would you feel knowing that saving your friend might damn yourself? Father Dufresne spent the day of August 21st in meticulous preparation for the ceremony that would culminate his family's generations-long pursuit of power over death itself. The ritual required precise timing, exact positioning, and implements that had been consecrated through previous ceremonies conducted at this same location over nearly 2 centuries. Every detail mattered. A single error could result not just in failure, but in consequences that would make death seem like mercy. The central chamber beneath the parish had been prepared according to specifications written in his ancestors' blood-stained journals. 7 candles made from the rendered fat of previous victims formed a perfect heptagon around the circular floor pattern. Incense burned in braziers positioned at specific compass points, its smoke carrying the scent of herbs that grew only in graveyards and the ashes of books that the Catholic Church had ordered destroyed centuries ago. The implements themselves told the story of Father Dufresne's heretical lineage, a ceremonial blade forged from metal that had been tempered in the blood of martyrs, though not Christian martyrs, chalices carved from the skulls of those who had glimpsed other realms and been driven mad by the experience, texts written in languages that predated human speech, their pages made from skin that had never belonged to any earthly creature. Sister Marie Claire's participation required its own preparation. Father Dufresne had provided her with vestments that appeared traditional but bore subtle modifications, symbols sewn into the fabric with thread spun from materials that should not exist, colors that seemed to shift depending on the angle of observation. When she wore these garments, her voice would carry authority that extended beyond the physical world, lending her words the power to bind souls and break the barriers between dimensions. The timing was critical. The dark moon would reach its zenith at midnight on August 22nd, providing exactly 1 hour during which the spiritual barriers between worlds would be thin enough for the ritual to succeed. The ceremony itself required 3 hours to complete, beginning at 11 o'clock when the moon entered its darkest phase. Each girl would be consumed in sequence, their life force channeled through the underground chamber's geometric patterns and focused through implements that had been drinking spiritual energy for generations. Father Dufresne had also prepared contingencies. He knew that the remaining girls might attempt rescue, that desperate parents might finally overcome their fear, that civil authorities might eventually respond to the growing hysteria in the community. The underground network provided multiple escape routes, and he had allies in New Orleans who would ensure his safe passage to other locations where similar ceremonies could be conducted if necessary. But he preferred to complete his work at St. Marguerite's Parish, where the spiritual foundation laid by his ancestors would amplify the ritual's effectiveness beyond anything possible at a new location. As night approached, he allowed himself the luxury of anticipation. By tomorrow's dawn, he would command powers that would make him effectively immortal, unless, of course, someone possessed the courage and knowledge necessary to stop him. What drives someone to pursue power at the cost of innocent lives? The 5 remaining girls spent the afternoon of August 21st planning a rescue that would have challenged experienced soldiers, let alone children aged 8 to 13. They gathered in the sugar mill's collapsed office, its broken furniture providing makeshift seating while afternoon sunlight filtered through holes in the rotted roof, creating patterns that shifted like living things across the moldy floor. Gabrielle returned from her underground reconnaissance with information that simultaneously offered hope and deepened their despair. Marie-Celeste was alive but imprisoned in a chamber that could only be reached through a labyrinth of tunnels crawling with malevolent energy. The ceremonial preparations they had witnessed suggested that time was running out. Candles, altars, and implements positioned for a ritual that would begin with tomorrow night's dark moon. The Fontenot twins had spent the day in a trance-like state, their consciousness somehow extending into the underground network through means they could not explain. They spoke in their eerie unison, describing passages and chambers that matched Gabrielle's physical observations with disturbing accuracy. 7 doors, they whispered together. 7 keys, 7 lights going out one by one. Their connection to the spiritual realm that had always unsettled other children now provided crucial intelligence about Father Dufresne's preparations. Evangeline Tran contributed knowledge passed down through her grandmother's stories about places where spirits gathered and fed. The underground chamber was what her people called a hungry place, a location where repeated trauma had weakened the barriers between worlds. Such places grew stronger with each act of violence, each moment of despair, until they developed a kind of appetite for human suffering. Fighting Father Dufresne would require more than physical courage. They would need spiritual protection against forces that could drive adults insane. Little Antoinette Guillory, who saw things others missed, provided the most disturbing revelation of all. She pointed toward the parish building and whispered, "Not 7, 8. When the others pressed her for clarification, she could only repeat the words while tracing symbols in the dirt that resembled the ones the twins had been drawing compulsively. Someone else was involved in Father Dufresne's plans. Someone the girls had not yet identified as a threat. Their plan was necessarily simple because complex strategies would collapse under the pressure of their fear and inexperience. They would enter the underground network after dark, following Gabrielle's mental map to reach Marie-Celeste's prison. They would free her and attempt to escape through the tunnel system before Father Dufresne discovered their presence. If cornered, they would fight with stolen kitchen knives and the desperate fury of children protecting each other. The plan had a dozen fatal flaws, any one of which could result in all 6 girls becoming victims instead of rescuers. But doing nothing guaranteed that Marie-Celeste would die, and eventually Father Dufresne would come for each of them in turn. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they prepared to risk everything for a friend they might already be too late to save. Would you attempt a rescue you knew was probably doomed to fail? Darkness fell over St. Marguerite's Parish like a funeral shroud, bringing with it an oppressive weight that seemed to press against the very souls of all who lived within its boundaries. The air itself felt thick as honey, making each breath a conscious effort, while sounds carried strangely. Conversations from distant houses reached the parish building with unnatural clarity, while screams from nearby seemed muffled and distorted. Father Dufresne began his final preparations as the church bells chimed 9 o'clock. He descended into the underground chamber wearing vestments that had been passed down through 5 generations of his heretical family, their fabric woven with threads that gleamed like oil in the candlelight. The ceremonial implements awaited his touch, arranged according to diagrams that depicted the precise positioning required to channel spiritual energy through the chamber's carved geometry. Marie-Celeste Boudreau felt the change immediately. The chains that bound her to the stone wall grew colder, their metal surfaces beginning to hum with vibrations that seemed to resonate through her bones. The symbols carved into the chamber floor started to emit a faint phosphorescent glow, creating patterns of light that hurt to look at directly. She could sense something vast and hungry stirring in the spaces between the carved lines, something that had been waiting for this night for a very long time. Sister Marie-Claire knelt in the main chapel above, rosary beads cutting into her palms as she gripped them with desperate intensity. She had made her choice to help the girls discover Marie-Celeste's location, but now she faced the consequences of that decision. Father Dufresne had made it clear that any interference would result in the deaths of her family members, torture that would make the ritual itself seem merciful by comparison. Her prayers had become a litany of apologies for sins she had not yet committed, but knew she would be forced to perform. Above ground, the 5 remaining girls made their final preparations in the abandoned sugar mill. They had armed themselves with kitchen knives stolen from their homes, along with candles, rope, and matches wrapped in oiled cloth to keep them dry in the damp underground passages. Evangeline Tran carried protective herbs her grandmother had given her, while the Fontenot twins clutched each other's hands with white-knuckled intensity, their shared consciousness extending into the underground network to monitor Father Dufresne's movements. The parents, those who remained awake, felt the wrongness pressing against their windows like a living thing. Children throughout the parish cried without cause, pets cowered under beds and refused to emerge, and even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. Dr. Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau would later write in his journal that the very air seemed to thicken as midnight approached, making each breath taste of copper and sulfur. As the clock struck 10, the 5 girls began their journey toward the parish building, walking through streets that felt more like a descent into hell than a path through their familiar neighborhood. The night of reckoning had begun, and before dawn, either evil would triumph or courage would prevail. How do you think the atmosphere of a place changes when terrible things are about to happen? The foundation door opened for the 5 girls with the same eerie ease that had surprised Gabrielle during her earlier reconnaissance. The ancient lock turned smoothly, as if something on the other side was eager for their arrival. The wooden panels swung inward without sound, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness so complete it seemed solid, like black water that would drown anyone who tried to breathe it. Evangeline Tran went first, her small hands steady as she held a candle that flickered but refused to die completely. The protective herbs her grandmother had pressed into her palms seemed to pulse with warmth, providing comfort against the supernatural cold that rose from the underground passages. Behind her, the Fontenot twins moved as one organism, their identical steps creating a rhythm that echoed strangely in the stone corridors. The underground network was worse than Gabrielle's descriptions had prepared them for. The passages branched and twisted like the interior of some massive, malevolent organism, each junction offering multiple choices that could lead to salvation or doom. The walls themselves seemed alive, their carved symbols shifting in the peripheral vision, rearranging themselves when not observed directly. What appeared to be crude care. The paintings in direct candlelight became complex geometric patterns when glimpsed from the corner of the eye. Little Antoinette Guillory, bringing up the rear, kept looking over her shoulder and whispering to invisible companions. The other girls had initially dismissed this as her usual strange behavior, but now they began to understand that she was receiving guidance from sources they could not perceive. Left at the crying stones, she would whisper, pointing toward passages that seemed identical to the others. Don't touch the symbols that move. Her bird-like voice carried an authority that belied her 9 years of life. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air tasted of metal and old blood, while sounds echoed in ways that defied physical laws. Whispers seemed to come from directly behind them, while their own footsteps sounded as if they were walking through different chambers entirely. The candle flames began to burn different colors: blue for Evangeline, green for the twins, red for Gabrielle, and white for Antoinette. The illumination they provided seemed to reveal more than ordinary light should show, casting shadows that contained glimpses of other times, other ceremonies, other victims. Josephine Bro, still reeling from the knowledge that her own mother had accepted payment for her participation in the ritual, carried the weight of betrayal along with her stolen kitchen knife. Every step deeper into the underground labyrinth felt like a step away from the world where such betrayals were possible, into a realm governed by older, more primal laws. They followed passages that had been carved by hands both human and otherwise, each turn taking them closer to a confrontation for which no childhood experience could have prepared them. The only certainty was that there would be no retreat. The passages behind them had begun to change, sealing off their escape routes with stones that appeared and disappeared like living things. What would it feel like to walk deeper into a place you knew was designed to trap you? The central chamber opened before them like the mouth of some primordial beast, its circular floor carved with geometric patterns that seemed to writhe and pulse in the flickering candlelight. 7 altars formed a perfect heptagon around the room's perimeter, each bearing implements that had no place in any Christian ceremony. The air itself felt thick with accumulated malevolence, centuries of rituals that had stained the very stones with spiritual corruption. Marie-Celeste Boudreau hung from chains set into the far wall, her wrists raw from struggling against bonds that grew tighter with each attempt at escape. She had been dressed in white robes that might have appeared bridal in different circumstances, but here took on the appearance of a burial shroud. Her eyes widened with desperate hope when she saw her friends enter the chamber, but that hope was immediately tempered by horror at their presence in this unholy place. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of water dripping from unseen sources. "This place, it changes you just by being here. It gets inside your thoughts and makes you see things that aren't real, or makes you wish things that aren't real were real." She gestured weakly toward the symbols covering the floor and walls. "Every person who dies here makes it stronger. Every drop of blood feeds something that was old when the world was young." Father Dufresne emerged from a side passage with the silent grace of a hunting predator. He wore vestments that appeared black in the chamber's dim light but revealed threads of deep red when the candlelight caught them at certain angles. His face bore an expression of mild disappointment, like a teacher whose students had failed to grasp an obvious lesson. "Children," he said, his culture voice echoing strangely in the circular chamber. "You have made this so much more difficult than necessary. The ritual requires willing participants, girls who accept their fate through despair rather than meeting death through resistance. Your presence here, your pathetic attempt at rescue, will only prolong their suffering and complicate the ceremony." Sister Marie-Claire appeared behind him, her face pale as candle wax, wearing vestments that hurt to look at directly. Her eyes held the desperate look of someone caught between impossible choices, each one leading to damnation. In her trembling hands, she carried a book bound in what appeared to be human skin, its pages filled with text that seemed to move and shift when viewed directly. The chamber's carved patterns began to glow with phosphorescent light as Father Dufresne took his position at the central altar. The ritual implements sang with harmonics that bypassed the ears and resonated directly through bone and blood. Ancient words began to spill from his lips, syllables that predated human language and carried meanings that threatened to drive listeners insane. The ceremony was beginning, whether the girls were ready or not. Midnight was still 2 hours away, but in this place beneath the earth, time itself was subject to older laws. How do you find courage when facing something beyond human comprehension? Father Dufresne's voice filled the chamber with words that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously, creating harmonics that resonated through the carved stone and into the bones of everyone present. The ancient syllables he spoke belonged to languages that had never been meant for human tongues, each phrase causing the phosphorescent symbols to pulse brighter while the very air grew thick with malevolent energy. The 5 girls found themselves unable to move, not through physical restraint, but because the ritual's beginning had created a supernatural paralysis that froze their muscles while leaving their consciousness cruelly aware. They could see, hear, and understand everything that was happening, but their bodies refused to obey their desperate commands to flee or fight or save their friend. Marie-Celeste Boudreau felt the change immediately as the ceremony commenced. The chains holding her to the wall grew warm, then hot, their metal surfaces beginning to glow with the same phosphorescent light that outlined the floor patterns. But the heat brought no comfort. Instead, it seemed to burn away something essential within her, some vital spark that made life worth living. She could feel her spiritual energy being drawn out through the metal links, flowing into the chamber's geometric patterns like water flowing downhill. Sister Marie-Claire began reading from the skin-bound book, her voice cracking with the effort required to speak words that violated every vow she had taken. The text itself seemed to resist being read, its letters rearranging themselves even as she tried to focus on them. Each syllable that passed her lips felt like a small death, another step away from the light of heaven and deeper into shadows that had no end. The chamber responded to the ritual's beginning with unmistakable hunger. The carved symbols spread across walls and floor began to move more rapidly, forming new patterns and configurations that hurt to perceive directly. The 7 altars around the room's perimeter started to emit their own light, revealing implements that seemed to shift and change shape when not observed directly. Candle flames throughout the space turned colors that existed nowhere in nature, blues that spoke of ocean depths where sunlight never penetrated, reds that carried the warmth of fresh blood, greens that suggested decay and corruption. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that began to emerge from the stones themselves. Not echoes or reverberations, but voices speaking in those same impossible languages Father Dufresne was using. The chamber was filling with presences that existed in spaces between the physical world and whatever realm the ritual was designed to access. Some of these voices belonged to previous victims, girls who had died in this same ceremony over the decades, their souls trapped within the geometric patterns carved into floor and walls. The dark moon would not reach its zenith for 2 hours, but the ritual's opening phase was already transforming the underground chamber into something that existed partially outside normal reality. The girls were no longer just trying to rescue their friend, they were fighting for their souls. Do you believe some places can trap souls, keeping them from moving on to whatever comes after death? In the moment when all seemed lost, when Father Dufresne's ritual had paralyzed their bodies and begun draining Marie-Celeste's life force, the 5 girls discovered they were not alone in their desperate fight. The voices emerging from the chamber's walls belonged not just to previous victims, but to spirits who had been waiting decades for someone brave enough to challenge the unholy ceremonies conducted in this underground horror. Evangeline Tran felt them first, her grandmother's protective herbs beginning to pulse with warmth that spread through her paralyzed limbs. The ancestral spirits her family had honored for generations recognized the wrongness permeating this place and offered their strength to combat it. Her candle flame changed from blue to brilliant white, and suddenly she could move again, though each step required enormous effort, as if she were walking through invisible water. The Fontenot twins experienced their psychic connection expanding beyond each other to encompass the ghostly presences trapped within the chamber's geometry. Dozens of young voices began speaking through their mouths. Girls who had died in similar rituals but whose spiritual essence had never been fully consumed. These trapped souls had been waiting for someone with the proper receptivity to channel their combined will against their murderer. "We are not alone," the twins spoke in perfect unison, but their voices carried harmonics that suggested many throats speaking as one. "The dead remember, the dead hunger for justice, the dead will help us break the chains that bind us all to this place." Little Antoinette Guillory's second sight revealed the chamber as it truly was, not just a room carved from stone, but an intersection between worlds where spiritual energy could be manipulated by those with the knowledge and will to do so. The geometric patterns were not just decorative, they were a complex machine designed to capture and redirect life force. But machines could be broken if you understood their weak points. "The symbols," she whispered, her bird-like voice somehow carrying clearly over Father Dufresne's chanting. "We have to break the symbols, not all of them, just the ones that connect the circles to the center. Break the flow, break the ritual." Gabrielle Arsenault felt strength returning to her limbs as the protective influence of the allied spirits battled against the ritual's paralyzing effects. Her stolen kitchen knife grew warm in her hand, as if blessed by presences that understood the necessity of violence when confronting absolute evil. The blade's reflection showed not just her own face, but glimpses of other girls who had once wielded weapons in this same desperate fight. Even Josephine Brault, weighed down by her mother's betrayal, found courage in the knowledge that she was not the first child to be sold by adults who should have protected her. The spirits of previous victims whispered that surviving such betrayal was possible, that healing could come after justice. The battle for their souls had allies among the dead, but victory would require the living to risk everything. How would it feel to have the spirits of previous victims helping you fight their killer? The chamber erupted into spiritual warfare as the allied spirits clashed with the malevolent forces Father Dufresne had summoned. Phosphorescent symbols flared and dimmed in rapid succession as competing energies fought for control over the geometric patterns carved into stone. The very air crackled with supernatural tension, creating an atmosphere so charged that hair stood on end and metal surfaces sparked with static electricity. Father Dufresne's chanting faltered as he realized that his carefully planned ritual was being disrupted by influences he had not anticipated. His face contorted with rage as he saw the 5 girls beginning to move despite the paralysis that should have held them motionless. The book in Sister Marie Claire's trembling hands began smoking, its skin pages curling at the edges as spiritual forces battled over its unholy contents. "Impossible!" Father Dufresne snarled, abandoning the precise pronunciation required for his ancient invocations. "The ritual has begun. The connections are established. 7 souls are bound to this ceremony, and 7 souls will be consumed before dawn breaks over this accursed place." But Antoinette Guillory had identified the ritual's weakness. The geometric patterns that channeled spiritual energy relied on unbroken lines connecting the outer altars to the central focus point. If even one of these connections was severed, the entire structure would collapse like a house of cards. She pointed toward specific symbols with her small finger, guiding Gabrielle toward the most vulnerable points in the chamber's carved network. Gabrielle attacked the symbols with her kitchen knife, the blade biting into stone that should have been too hard for such a simple tool to damage. But the spirits of previous victims guided her strikes, showing her exactly where to apply pressure to maximum effect. Each broken line sent shockwaves through the chamber's supernatural architecture, causing Father Dufresne's ritual to stutter and misfire. The Fontenot twins began speaking in the voices of the trapped spirits, reciting counter-incantations that had been passed down through oral traditions predating Christianity. Their words carried the accumulated hatred of every girl who had died in this chamber, decades of rage finally finding expression through living throats. The phosphorescent patterns began flickering erratically as competing magical systems fought for dominance. Evangeline Tran's protective herbs burst into flame, but instead of burning her hands, they created a barrier of purifying fire that began consuming the unholy symbols nearest to her position. The flames spread along the carved lines like spilled oil, erasing the careful work of generations and releasing the spiritual energy that had been trapped within the geometric prison. Marie-Celeste felt the chains holding her begin to loosen as the ritual's power structure collapsed. But freedom came with a terrible price. The chamber itself was becoming unstable, its walls beginning to crack as supernatural forces pulled it apart from within. They had perhaps minutes to escape before the entire underground network collapsed, burying everyone within these tunnels forever. But first, they had to survive Father Dufresne's final desperate gambit. What happens when someone with great power realizes they're about to lose everything? Father Dufresne abandoned all pretense of controlled ritual as his carefully planned ceremony collapsed into chaos around him. His silk vestments tore as his body began changing, revealing that the power he had inherited from his ancestors came with a physical price. His hands elongated into claws capable of rending stone, his face stretched into something that might once have been human, but now bore only passing resemblance to anything born of woman. "If I cannot have perfect vessels," he snarled through teeth that had become fangs, "then I will take what I can get. Your terror will feed me. Your despair will sustain me. Your deaths will grant me enough power to begin again elsewhere." Sister Marie Claire screamed as the book in her hands burst into flames that burned cold rather than hot, its pages releasing decades of trapped spiritual energy in a single violent explosion. The blast knocked her to the ground, but it also shattered the last connections between the outer altars and the central focus point. The chamber's geometric network collapsed entirely, sending cracks racing across walls and ceiling. The freed spirits of previous victims manifested visibly for the first time, appearing as translucent figures that surrounded Father Dufresne with decades of accumulated hatred. They could not touch him directly. Death had severed their connection to the physical world, but their presence weakened his supernatural abilities and revealed the true scope of his crimes. Dozens of girls ranging in age from 8 to 16, each bearing the wounds that had killed them, each demanding justice that had been denied for too long. Marie-Celeste Boudreau broke free from her chains as the metal finally succumbed to the spiritual forces tearing the chamber apart. But freedom came at the cost of terrible knowledge. Her time in this unholy place had left her able to see the same spiritual realm that had always been visible to little Antoinette. She could perceive the true horror of what Father Dufresne had become, the writhing mass of stolen souls that formed the core of his being. The 5 rescue girls formed a protective circle around their freed friend, kitchen knives raised against an enemy that conventional weapons could not truly harm. But they were no longer ordinary children armed with stolen cutlery. They had become vessels for the protective spirits of previous victims, channels through which decades of righteous anger could finally find expression. The battle that followed lasted only minutes but felt like hours. Father Dufresne's supernatural strength was matched against the combined will of every girl who had ever died in this chamber. Physical violence merged with spiritual warfare as the underground network continued to collapse around them, stone blocks falling like rain from a ceiling that could no longer support its own weight. When the dust settled, Father Dufresne lay broken among the rubble, his stolen power finally spent. But their ordeal was far from over. They still had to escape a collapsing underground maze before it became their tomb. How do you think justice feels when it's been delayed for decades? The chamber's destruction triggered a catastrophic chain reaction throughout the entire underground network. Centuries-old support structures, weakened by decades of supernatural energy, began failing in sequence like dominoes falling in predetermined patterns. The girls had perhaps 10 minutes to navigate a labyrinth they barely knew, while sections of tunnel collapsed behind them, sealing off passages and creating new obstacles with every passing moment. Marie-Celeste, despite her ordeal, proved to be their salvation. Her time imprisoned in the chamber had forced her to study every detail of the carved symbols and geometric patterns, knowledge that now translated into an intuitive understanding of the tunnel system's layout. She could sense which passages led toward the surface and which descended deeper into the earth, which routes would hold against the collapse, and which were already compromised. "This way," she called, leading them through passages that groaned under the stress of shifting stone. Her white ceremonial robes, torn and stained from her captivity, seemed to glow with residual spiritual energy, providing illumination in corridors where their candles had been extinguished by falling debris. The Fontenot twins brought up the rear, their psychic connection now extending to encompass all 6 girls. They could sense danger before it manifested physically, calling out warnings about unstable ceiling sections and blocked passages. Their identical voices created an eerie harmony that somehow helped the group maintain cohesion despite the chaos surrounding them. Evangeline Tran's protective herbs continued to burn with purifying fire, creating a barrier against the malevolent influences that still lingered in the collapsing tunnels. The underground network had been stained by too many dark ceremonies to be cleansed easily, and hostile spirits attempted to lead them astray with false promises of safety and escape. Little Antoinette Guillory's second sight proved invaluable as she identified passages that appeared solid but were actually illusions created by the dying network's supernatural defenses. Her bird-like voice guided them away from phantom routes that would have led them deeper into the earth rather than toward the surface. Gabrielle Arsenault used her kitchen knife to mark their passage, scratching arrows into stone walls to ensure they didn't circle back through passages that all looked identical in the chaos of collapse and confusion. Her natural leadership abilities kept the group moving when exhaustion and terror threatened to overwhelm their desperate flight. Josephine Brault, still carrying the weight of her mother's betrayal, found strength in protecting friends who had risked everything to save Marie-Celeste. Each step toward freedom was also a step toward a new life, one where she would never again trust adults who claimed to have her best interests at heart. Behind them, the chamber where Father Dufresne had died continued its violent destruction, the accumulated spiritual energy of decades finally finding release in an explosion that would be felt for miles. Above the parish building began to settle and crack as its hidden foundation finally gave way. They were racing, not just against collapsing tunnels, but against time itself. Do you think some places need to be destroyed to free the souls trapped within them? The 6 girls emerged from the underground horror just as the first pale light of dawn touched the Louisiana sky. They crawled through the foundation door that had started their descent into nightmare, gasping the sweet morning air like drowning victims reaching the surface of a lake. Behind them, the earth continued to shake as the tunnel network completed its violent collapse, swallowing forever the chamber where so many innocents had died. St. Marguerite's parish building stood empty against the morning sky, its walls cracked and windows shattered by the underground explosion. The structure that had housed centuries of dark secrets was finally succumbing to the weight of its hidden sins. By noon, nothing would remain but rubble and the promise that no future ceremonies could ever be conducted in that unholy place. The girls themselves bore the visible marks of their ordeal. Their clothes were torn and stained with substances that might have been mud but possessed an organic quality that suggested less innocent origins. Their eyes held knowledge that no children should carry, wisdom purchased at the price of innocence lost forever. They would never again be able to see the world as a place where adults could be trusted to protect the young. But they were alive, and they were free, and most importantly, they had saved their friend from a fate that would have consumed not just her body, but her very soul. The parents who found them gathered near the destroyed parish building wept with relief and horror in equal measure. Isabelle Boudreau held her daughter with desperate intensity, as if physical contact could somehow heal the spiritual wounds that Marie-Celeste's captivity had inflicted. The other families surrounded their children with protective embraces that came too late to prevent trauma, but might still provide comfort for the healing that would have to come. Dr. Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau arrived within hours, summoned by reports of the parish building's collapse and the emergence of 6 children from what appeared to be solid earth. His medical examination found them physically healthy despite their ordeal, but he noted symptoms of exposure to influences that had no place in his scientific understanding of the world. His private journals would document changes in their behavior and abilities that defied conventional explanation. Sister Marie-Claire was never seen again. Some claimed she had fled during the underground chaos, escaping through passages that connected to the natural cave system extending for miles beneath Louisiana. Others whispered that she had been consumed by the same forces she had helped to unleash, her soul torn apart by the competing demands of duty and conscience. Her empty room was found filled with prayer books whose pages had been burned away, leaving only blank covers and the lingering scent of sulfur. The official investigation concluded that the parish building's collapse was caused by unstable foundations undermined by recent flooding. No mention was made of Father Dufresne, who had never officially existed according to church records. The truth was buried along with the tunnels, known only to 6 girls who would carry its weight for the rest of their lives. How do you think surviving such horror changes someone forever? Years passed before the full truth of what happened at St. Marguerite's parish became clear. And when it did, the revelation came through sources that authorities preferred to dismiss as imagination rather than evidence. The 6 survivors grew into women who carried their shared trauma like a secret language, communicating through glances and gestures that spoke of knowledge too terrible for ordinary words. Marie-Celeste Boudreau left Louisiana immediately. Upon reaching adulthood, traveling to distant cities where no one knew her history or could recognize the haunted quality that never quite left her eyes. She became a teacher, dedicating her life to protecting children from the very dangers the adults in her own childhood had failed to recognize. Her classroom was always filled with candles, and students noted that she seemed to possess an uncanny ability to identify troubling situations before they fully developed. The Fontenot twins remained together throughout their lives, their psychic connection deepened by shared trauma into something that bordered on a single consciousness distributed across 2 bodies. They established a home for displaced children, creating a sanctuary where young victims of abuse could find safety and understanding from women who truly comprehended the nature of adult evil. Evangeline Tran returned to her family's homeland, carrying with her the protective traditions her grandmother had taught her, along with new knowledge about places where spiritual energy could be corrupted. She became a healer specializing in trauma that transcended the merely psychological, working with victims of supernatural encounters that conventional medicine could not address. Gabrielle Arsenault channeled her natural leadership and hard-won skepticism into law enforcement, becoming one of the first female detectives in Louisiana. Her cases often involved crimes against children, investigations that she pursued with a relentless intensity that made her colleagues uncomfortable. She had an unusual talent for recognizing when conventional explanations failed to account for all the evidence. Little Antoinette Guillory's second sight never faded, and she learned to use it in service of justice rather than terror. She worked as a private investigator, specializing in missing persons cases, particularly those involving children who had vanished under circumstances that defied logical explanation. Her success rate was legendary, though she rarely discussed her methods with anyone who lacked first-hand experience with the supernatural. Josephine Brault became a writer, documenting stories of survival and resilience while carefully avoiding any direct reference to her own experiences. Her novels explored themes of betrayal and redemption, always featuring young protagonists who found strength to overcome impossible odds. Readers praised her ability to capture the authentic voice of trauma without ever quite understanding why her fictional accounts felt so disturbingly real. The 6 women maintained contact throughout their lives, gathering annually on August 22nd to remember the night that changed them forever and to ensure that no similar evil ever again threatened the innocent. They were the keepers of a terrible truth that the world was not ready to hear, guardians against horrors that most people preferred to believe were merely fictional. Their silence protected not just their own sanity, but the peace of mind of everyone who had never faced the reality of supernatural evil made manifest. The bishop they mentioned in whispered conversations never came forward to acknowledge what had happened at St. Marguerite's Parish, taking his knowledge to a grave that would forever mark him as a man who chose institutional protection over the lives of innocent children. Some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, but too important to forget entirely. Do you believe some secrets must be kept to protect both the innocent and the guilty from truths too terrible to bear?